If you've been feeling it lately, that sharp, sometimes overwhelming sense of division rippling through modern society, you're definitely not alone.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like more than just disagreeing on policy, right? It's deeper, often feels personal, like the very ground rules of being together are shifting. For
Yeah.
you, navigating this landscape might feel confusing, maybe even exhausting.
That feeling is incredibly common. It's not just about the political arguments.
Yeah.
There's a palpable sense of something fundamentally broken, a loss of shared understanding or even, well, shared reality sometimes.
Absolutely. And that feeling of deep fracture is exactly what we're diving into today. We have a really unique source guiding us, a book titled Civic Synkronia for Colombia, a practical application of the Ontosinclecticim framework to repair division and restore coherence.
Okay.
It's written by José Julio Córdova Jaramillo, known as Jota, and what's particularly interesting is his collaborator, a customized AI named Onto.
And AI.
Yeah. Designed specifically to reason using the book's core framework.
Interesting. So the book positions this collaboration not as, like, replacing human insight, but maybe as a way to explore the framework's deeper logic and maybe its potential for scaling these complex ideas.
Exactly. It's framed as an exploration of using AI as a tool to help us understand and perhaps apply these big systemic ideas that are, frankly, hard for a single human mind to hold all at once.
That makes sense. A tool for complexity.
That's a fascinating starting point in itself. So let's unpack the book's core premise. Its fundamental argument is that this dangerous societal polarization we feel isn't just political or ideological.
Right.
It's actually a symptom, a signal of a deeper collapse in social coherence that's happening across multiple intertwined systems.
Okay, multiple systems like what?
We're talking about the foundational elements of society.
Right.
How we use language, our shared history and memory, our emotional trust in each other and institutions, the narratives around economic justice, our very symbolic identity. The problem, as the book sees it, is one of systemic fragmentation and desynchronization, things being out of sync.
That reframing is key.
Yeah.
The book insists that polarization is the visible outcome, like a fever, but not the underlying disease.
Right.
It's arguing the illness is sustained by these structural issues that have become embedded over time. Historical trauma, linguistic dissonance, where words lose common meaning,
Yeah.
symbolic injustice, where groups feel erased, and a pervasive emotional unsafety woven across these social systems. It's deep.
And the book's proposed solution to this multi-system fragmentation is called Civic Synkronia.
Okay.
It's presented as a multidimensional healing framework built upon something called the Ontosinclecticim method.
Ontosinclecticism. Bit of a mouthful.
It is, but the source describes it as a comprehensive, systems-based, non-fragmentary approach aimed specifically at restoring rhythm, trust, and coherence in fractured societies like Colombia.
So think of it less like solving individual problems and more like, I don't know, retraining a collective nervous system.
That's a great way to put it. The framework aims to align a nation's emotional truth, structural design, symbolic coherence, and historical integration into a unified civic rhythm.
So it's not about fixing one piece in isolation.
No, exactly. It's about getting everything to work together, in sync, like a healthy biological system.
Okay, I get that.
Right. And this brings us to that term, ontosinclecticism. It sounds complex, but the book gives us a clear breakdown of its roots to help us understand it.
Good. Let's hear it.
Okay, so it blends three core ideas. Ontology, which is the study of being and systems, how things fundamentally exist and relate.
Right, the nature of things.
Then syncretism, the blending of different beliefs, practices, or frameworks.
Okay, mixing things.
And eclecticism, which is the practice of choosing what seems best or useful from diverse sources.
So ontology, syncretism, eclecticism. OSE, ontosinclecticism. Okay.
Exactly.
The source describes ontosinclecticism as a highly disciplined process then, not just randomly grabbing ideas.
Precisely. It's about carefully integrating the coherent, functional aspects of diverse systems, philosophical, political, linguistic, emotional, into a unified living structure.
They call it precision synthesis, right? Deliberately contrasting it with just chaotic mixing.
Yes, exactly. It's about finding the underlying logic that connects things, the coherence.
And there's a core principle within ontosinclecticism that the book highlights as absolutely crucial for civic repair: affirmative expansion.
Affirmative expansion. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Well, instead of using contrast or negation framing, the classic "this is X because it is not Y," or "we're this against them," it builds clarity and connection through layering. The approach is this is X and also Y.
Okay, so it adds layers instead of setting up opposition.
Exactly. The source argues this principle is vital because it eliminates unnecessary contradiction and invites coherence instead of opposition. Applied to complex areas like politics, it allows for multiple perspectives or truths to coexist and be built upon rather than forcing a binary choice.
It's about seeing the simultaneous layers of reality instead of reducing everything to simple, often adversarial opposites. For you, thinking about the arguments you hear daily, imagine how different the conversation feels if someone says, this policy aims to reduce taxes, and also we need to consider its impact on social services.
Right.
Versus, this policy is good because it's not the other side's bad policy. It fundamentally changes the structure of thought and dialogue.
It shifts from a logic of exclusion and opposition to one of inclusion and synthesis.
More constructive, potentially.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to use this book's comprehensive framework, applied primarily to Colombia as the case study, to understand the actual architecture of division, the structural how behind the feeling of fracture, and then explore the structured protocol it offers for repair. The book uses Colombia as a powerful, real-world laboratory to model this path, suggesting the framework is applicable to any fractured society. And it's crucial to remember, as the source explicitly states, the goal here is understanding the framework and its application to societal breakdown, not getting bogged down in or debating the specific, complex politics of Colombia.
Absolutely. We're looking at the method through the lens of a specific context.
Got it. The framework itself is the focus.
Perfect. With that foundation laid, let's jump into part one and really dig into what the book means by understanding the fracture going beyond just the political surface.
Okay, let's do it.
Kicking off part one, chapter one of the book gets right to the heart of the problem, asking, what is being polarized?
Good question.
The source insists it's not just political camps or ideologies. It's the very foundational structures of shared meaning that are fracturing.
Yeah, that's the core insight. When society polarizes at this dangerous level, it's because the basic building blocks of shared reality are breaking down. Language, emotional memory, symbolic identity.
Yeah.
These things that allow us to understand each other and our collective past, they're no longer coherent across groups. They mean different things to different people.
The book argues that polarization isn't the cause of societal breakdown, but rather a signal that something much deeper is wrong. A multi-system desynchronization.
A signal like the fever analogy again?
Exactly. It's like different parts of the social body are operating on completely different clocks,
Right.
When people can't even agree on what's real, when historical narratives are utterly incompatible, when speech becomes less about conveying meaning and more about defending tribal identity, that's disintegration, not just disagreement.
The source makes the point that attempts at simple dialogue or moderation often fail precisely because the people talking aren't actually standing on the same ground. They're interpreting the same words, the same events, the same symbols through completely incompatible narrative realities.
Like the word justice or freedom.
Exactly. They can mean diametrically opposed things depending on which reality you inhabit. It's a divide built on incompatible understandings of the world, rooted in different experiences and historical interpretations.
So the book fundamentally reframes polarization. It's not a debate to be moderated.
No.
It's a multi-system breakdown that needs systemic repair. The battlefield, terrifyingly, becomes meaning itself. Words lose their shared definitions and become weapons, tribal identifiers.
Yeah.
For you, thinking about your own social media feeds or conversations, you might see this in action terms that used to have a common understanding, now instantly signal your perceived allegiance.
It's exhausting.
Yeah.
And chapter 1 doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah.
It breaks down this fracture into specific dimensions.
Yes, 5 specific interconnected dimensions. Let's walk through those. The first dimension of fracture is language.
Okay.
The book talks about the weaponization of symbols and semantic inflation. This is where words become hollowed out or overloaded, losing precise meaning and instead functioning primarily as identity triggers.
Words cease to be tools for building understanding and become flags waved in opposition. They divide us rather than connecting us to shared concepts. Like the currency of meaning gets debased.
Well put. Second is governance. This dimension fractures when public institutions suffer from broken feedback loops.
Meaning they don't respond effectively.
Right. They don't respond predictably or genuinely to the needs and input of the population. Leadership becomes performance for a specific audience rather than systemic function for the whole. And politics devolves into theater instead of effective infrastructure.
The rhythmic alignment between citizens and the state dissolves when trust in the system's responsiveness disappears. It feels like shouting into the void.
Third, and perhaps one of the most insightful points for you, is emotional infrastructure.
Emotional infrastructure. Interesting term.
The book describes nations as having collective nervous systems, which can become saturated with unresolved emotional residues, unresolved grief, historical betrayal, deep-seated humiliation.
Wow.
When this happens, emotional memory from the past starts to override and replace present reality.
So the past isn't just something you study. It's a constant, reactive emotional state driving current perception and behavior.
Exactly. It makes rational engagement almost impossible because the system is in a perpetual state of emotional alert, like it's always bracing for the next threat.
That rings true.
The fourth dimension is economic storytelling. This isn't just about the economy itself, but the deeply embedded narratives that shape how people understand wealth, poverty, and fairness.
The stories we tell about money and success.
Right. Inequality is framed morally. They're poor because they're lazy. They're rich because they're greedy. Poverty is narrated as either victimhood or personal failure, and wealth is either sanctified as earned merit or villainized as theft.
These competing and often contradictory economic stories don't just describe economic reality. They actively fracture social empathy, right? They create deep emotional rifts based on resentment or moral judgment rather than shared understanding of systemic issues.
Precisely. And finally, the fifth dimension is symbolic identity. This is where shared metaphors and national symbols collapse.
Like the flag or historical figures.
Exactly. The national flag, historical events, cultural heroes, they cease to mean the same thing to different groups. Symbolic identity dissolves into tribal allegiance, where symbols are owned and defended by one group against another.
When the very things meant to represent shared nationhood become partisan battlegrounds, there's very little common ground left to stand on, even symbolically.
One of the most compelling ideas in this chapter, for you grappling with the feeling of things being chaotic, is the book's point that this fracture isn't random chaos, it's rhythmic.
Rhythmic. How so?
Patterns of desynchronization occur when different system cycles fall out of sync. Think about the incredibly fast rhythm of social media, or 247 news cycles clashing with the slow, deliberate time justice systems require.
Yeah.
Or the speed of economic change versus the slow, generational time needed for social healing and trust building.
That misalignment creates systemic vertigo. That's a great term for it. You lose your civic bearings. You don't know what time it is, collectively or emotionally, because the signals from different systems are contradictory.
Right. This profound disorientation feeds distrust and deepens division.
So the critical shift required, according to Chapter 1, is moving away from purely political diagnostics, asking who is right and who is wrong politically, to civic diagnostics, asking which systems are out of sync and how is that desynchronization creating polarization.
Exactly. The goal isn't to win an argument, it's to diagnose a systemic illness and design structures that restore rhythm, trust, and coherence.
It's a complete reframing of the problem from one of ideological difference to one of fundamental systemic function and rhythm breakdown. That's a big shift in thinking.
It really is. Building on that idea of a national nervous system, Chapter 2 takes a deep dive into the role of historical betrayals and collective trauma in perpetuating division. It expands on that concept of civic memory.
Yes, it portrays civic memory as a nation's living nervous system. It's not just facts in a history book. It lives in collective emotion, in the silences about difficult events, and in the society's response to moments of tension, power imbalances, and broken promises. It's embodied.
The book argues that when this civic memory is ignored, denied, or distorted by those in power, that unresolved energy has to go somewhere. It discharges, often explosively in protest, or it fragments the society into tribes, each clinging to its own partial or wounded narrative.
Yeah, a nation carrying deep, unaddressed historical wounds can't be governed purely by logic. Its memory and its trauma must be acknowledged and integrated somehow. You can't just ignore it.
And the source makes a really powerful point about the nature of betrayal here. It's not just about individual leaders lying, it's systemic betrayal.
Systemic betrayal.
Oh.
How does it differ?
This comes from repeated patterns where public institutions and core systems consistently fail to honor the implicit social contract. This leads to long-term embedded distrust and fuels reactive ideologies.
So it's betrayal by structure, not just bad actors.
Exactly. Think about promises made through official channels like land reform, peace agreements, assurances of justice, or economic policies claiming broad benefit, which then repeatedly fail to materialize in a way that reaches or benefits the affected populations.
Right, the system itself lets people down over and over.
The book uses Colombia as a vivid example. The history of broken land reforms, peace accords that weren't fully implemented and were followed by violence, promises of justice that weren't matched by accountability, economic models benefiting a concentrated few.
These weren't just isolated failures, they were repeated civic patterns, making betrayal almost a national rhythm of disappointment and disillusionment. That's heavy.
It is. And when this systemic betrayal repeats over generations, the trauma becomes embedded in the very logic of governance.
How so? Trauma in governance logic.
Policy becomes reactive, designed to respond to emotional surges or crisis points rather than long-term needs. Leaders feel compelled to mirror the population's trauma in their rhetoric. Media amplifies the emotional charge, and citizens end up voting less to shape the future and more to punish the past or those they associate with past harms.
This trauma-driven governance is certainly not unique to Colombia, but it's seen there starkly, shaped by decades of civil war, paramilitary violence, displacement, and corruption. But the pattern is visible in any polarized society. The language of blame, policy cycles mirroring emotional cycles, the inability to build durable trust because the collective nervous system is constantly bracing for the next betrayal.
This collective trauma creates habits of division. These are deeply ingrained civic behaviors. Using identity as a proxy for truth. If they're part of that group, I can't trust what they say.
Expecting betrayal as the norm.
Right. Interpreting any disagreement as profound personal disrespect, constantly escalating narratives, and seeing politics primarily through the lens of historical grudges.
The book calls these the civic residues, the behavioral and emotional output of a national memory system that is deeply unsynchronized and wounded. Residues.
Yeah.
Like something left behind that keeps affecting things.
Exactly. The path towards healing, according to the book, requires actively designing historical repair, not just acknowledging that bad things happened.
Designing repair, what does that involve?
It needs civic choreography, creating new rituals, redesigning institutional formats, and intentionally restructuring language in ways that allow different groups to process collective pain and grief without simply reactivating the trauma or assigning blame in perpetual cycles.
So it's fundamentally about designing coherence around the difficult truths of history, rather than trying to rewrite history itself or force a single sanitized narrative.
Precisely. The Ontosinclectic approach to memory integration, which we'll touch on more later, involves moving from fragmented singular stories to shared multi-voice timelines, from cycles of blame to a clearer mapping of systemic responsibility, from purely reactive rhetoric to restorative language practices, and from fragmented individual remembrance to synchronized civic symbols that can hold complexity.
That sounds like a major undertaking.
It is, which brings us to Chapter 3, where the book explicitly presents Colombia as its primary case study, its living laboratory for demonstrating these concepts.
Okay, so Colombia is the example. It's framed as a landscape of profound contradictions, right? Astonishing biodiversity versus destructive extraction, peace agreements versus persistent conflict.
Yes, deep cultural coherence versus institutional fragmentation. The book sees these not just as paradoxes, but as critical systemic signals indicating deep unresolved tensions within the national structure.
In the language of Civic Synkronia, Colombia isn't just polarized, it's a desynchronized system, biologically rich, culturally vibrant, yet civically incoherent. Its different parts are moving at different speeds, driven by conflicting histories and emotional residues.
And the book's analysis of Colombian polarization views it as a powerful civic feedback loop. History shows recurring patterns of emotional escalation leading directly to systemic breakdown.
For example, shifts in political power often spike narrative tension across the society, triggering the reactivation of historical grievances and launching intense symbolic warfare where national symbols are weaponized. It's a cycle.
Right. The book describes key political factions in Colombia, like Uribismo and Petrismo, not just as holders of different political platforms, but as embodiments of conflicting civic memories and operating from different emotional archetypes.
Like stability via control versus justice via disruption.
Something like that. One group might prioritize stability, often associated with historical power structures and control, while the other might prioritize justice and disruption, often linked to historical exclusion and grievance.
Both factions claim legitimacy based on their version of history and their emotional priorities. Crucially, the book notes that both tend to weaponize language and narrative against the other, and neither, in their current form, offers a framework for genuine structural integration across these deep divides.
This creates an exhausting, perpetual loop that consumes civic energy, exhausts trust, and erodes institutional legitimacy. From the Civic Synkronia perspective, it's a fundamental failure to design rhythm across the political and social systems.
And language, as we touched on earlier, is highlighted as a particularly potent tool of division in the Colombian context. Words like oligarchy, castrochavismo, terrorist, guerrilla.
They aren't just descriptors. They carry immense emotional weight, encode historical trauma, and function as symbolic accusations that trigger immediate tribal reactions.
The language landscape itself becomes a weaponized zone. When basic terms lack shared meaning, the capacity for collective action or even basic coordination fails. Terms become tribal flags.
This is what the book calls linguistic incoherence. One of the core goals of conscious language within this framework is to actively synchronize meaning and emotional charge around shared civic vocabulary.
Economic inequality in Colombia is also analyzed through the lens of an emotional narrative, not just structural statistics. The economic divide isn't only about material disparity, it's deeply narrative.
How so?
Historical exclusion from foundational assets like land, education, and justice creates not just material deprivation, but profound symbolic erasure.
Symbolic erasure, meaning people feel invisible.
Or devalued. This erasure is encoded in national narratives that determine who is seen as truly part of the nation, who is trusted, who is blamed for problems. This creates a national emotional map saturated with resentment on one side, shame or denial on another, and defensiveness all around.
So economic injustice isn't just an economic problem. It actively generates powerful social rhythms of anger, distrust, and division.
And the Ontosinclectic perspective argues that economic design and narrative justice are completely codependent. You can't achieve stable economic justice without also repairing the narratives and symbols that define who is valued and who belongs.
So repair needs both structural changes and a resymbolizing of inclusion and a resynchronizing of the experience of justice for all.
Exactly.
Codependent.
Chapter 3 concludes by noting that Colombia is a country that has been intensely diagnosed, countless studies on its conflict, its economy, its politics, but it still lacks fundamental coherence. All right, so Civic Synkronia offers a different kind of response. Not another diagnosis, but a comprehensive framework and protocol designed to align emotional truth, structural design, symbolic coherence, and historical integration into a single, unified civic rhythm.
And this is why Colombia serves as the model. The book suggests that if its deep fractures can be mapped and its rhythms restructured using this multidimensional method, then the framework holds immense potential for application globally in any society grappling with profound fragmentation.
It's about demonstrating a path from rupture to rhythm, from polarization to coherence through deliberate civic design.
Which sets the stage beautifully for part 2, where the book dives deeper into the framework itself, the lens, and the solution. Let's take a short break, and then we'll jump into Ontosinclecticism and Civic Synkronia proper. Short musical break. Welcome back to our deep dive. We're moving into part 2, shifting from the diagnosis of societal fracture, using Colombia as a case study, to the actual framework proposed for repair in the book Civic Synkronia for Colombia. Chapter 4 tackles what is Ontosinclecticism.
Right, and it clarifies this is much more than just another political theory.
Yes, the source defines it as a comprehensive approach, a mode of thinking, a specific system design method, and even a philosophy of human coherence. It's rooted in the core belief that fragmentation—
the breakdown of systems, ideas, even consciousness.
Exactly. That fragmentation is the fundamental driver of dysfunction, both inside us and in society.
And it expands on the name's roots. Ontology, syncretism, eclecticism, describing it as that highly disciplined process of integrating the coherent functional aspects from a wide range of diverse systems.
Philosophical, political, linguistic, emotional, whatever works and holds together. The goal is to weave these into a unified, living structure. They call this precision synthesis.
Precision synthesis, not chaos, but intentional integration.
Right. And this disciplined synthesis is what allows it, the book claims, to transcend the typical left versus right political binaries that trap so many societies.
How does it do that?
It explicitly rejects totalizing ideologies built on rigid identity and opposition. Instead, it asks, what works across different domains and perspectives? How do we trace the root dysfunction causing problems rather than just fighting about the symptoms?
Okay.
And how do we reweave coherence using the best tools available without pledging allegiance to a specific political dogma?
So it fundamentally sees political conflict as a surface symptom of deeper issues.
Yes. Cognitive misalignment, where people process information differently. Linguistic confusion, where words have lost shared meaning and act like communication viruses. And social healing as a change in rhythm.
A change in rhythm, in how symbols are used, how habits are formed, how shared meaning is built over time.
Exactly. And the core principle of affirmative expansion is central to this methodology.
Right, the this is X and also Y approach, not X versus Y.
Precisely. It builds understanding through layering, allowing for complexity and multiplicity without forcing either choices.
They apply this layered thinking everywhere, don't they? Like a political leader isn't just a party rep.
They are also a carrier of symbolic memory for the nation. A policy isn't just about numbers.
It's also a narrative that shapes how people feel about their place in society. A word isn't just a linguistic term.
It's also a signal system embedded in deep emotional and historical context. This layered clarity, built from careful synthesis, is key to the method.
What's also striking, and perhaps most relevant to you on a personal level, is the connection the book makes between inner integration and civic repair.
How so?
Ontosinclecticim doesn't start only at the societal level, it starts with the individual. It emphasizes cultivating personal coherence, aligning your own emotional state, cognitive patterns, internal narratives, and relational practices.
The argument is powerful and simple. A fragmented, polarized citizen cannot effectively co-create a synchronized, coherent society.
Right. A mind that is constantly operating in binaries and opposition will project that same division onto the nation. So the framework explicitly bridges the personal work of self-synchronization with the collective work of civic repair.
That makes a lot of sense. The micro affects the macro.
Finally, Ontosinclecticim is presented as a form of civic technology. It's a sophisticated method for diagnosing the invisible architecture of dysfunction, tracing the specific points where systems are breaking down or out of sync, and then providing the tools to redesign institutions, rituals, and communication channels specifically for coherence.
Its power, the source says, lies in its practical application in education, media, governance, even personal practice. It makes visible the subtle but fundamental breakdowns that traditional political or economic categories often miss or oversimplify.
Okay, so that's the lens. Building on that, Chapter 5 then focuses specifically on explaining Civic Synkronia as the comprehensive repair framework.
Right. It defines it as a structural, diagnostic, and design tool.
That's exactly right. It's the applied arm of Ontosinclecticim. Civic Synkronia is the method for identifying the broken rhythms within a society's core systems and providing the protocols to restore alignment through synchronized reform.
From this perspective, political polarization, extremism, linguistic warfare, emotional fragmentation, these aren't just symptoms of bad ideas.
They are signals of a society that has profoundly lost its collective rhythm.
Got it. The book maps this across 6 interconnected systems, which it sometimes refers to as the 6 synchrony pillars or axes. These are the fundamental domains where repair and resynchronization are needed simultaneously.
Okay, the 6 pillars, what are they?
The source lists them as linguistic alignment, governance as rhythm, historical memory repair, emotional trust, economic justice through narrative calibration, and symbolic identity architecture.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. Let's touch on each one briefly. Linguistic alignment.
This is about ensuring that public language is precise, inclusive, and aligned with lived experience to restore shared meaning. It involves conscious semantics, being deliberate about word choice, narrative calibration, ensuring stories align with truth and purpose, and symbol repair, restoring shared meaning to contested symbols.
If language is weaponized and incoherent, it creates constant static in the civic nervous system. This pillar is about designing language to transmit coherence. Makes sense.
Second, governance as rhythm. This goes beyond just policies and laws. It's about managing the tempo of time, trust, and power within institutions.
Tempo, like the speed and timing.
Exactly. It means creating predictable feedback systems, establishing clear rituals of accountability, ensuring pattern stability in how institutions operate, and enabling truly meaningful public participation that is timed appropriately.
When governance is asynchronous, like rapid political announcements followed by delayed action, it erodes trust. This pillar focuses on designing institutions for predictability and responsive rhythm.
Okay.
Third,
memory repair. As we discussed, unresolved history poisons the present. This pillar is about actively reprocessing historical trauma without idealizing the past or erasing difficult truths.
And the goal isn't a single narrative, but synchronized truth.
Right. Creating a shared timeline or framework that can hold and respect multiple perspectives without collapsing into irresolvable contradiction.
It's about finding a civic grammar that allows different memories to be held within a shared container, enabling the society to move forward together.
Powerful. Fourth, emotional trust. The book views public life as resting on a shared emotional infrastructure. When fear, resentment, or apathy dominate, the system is unstable.
So this pillar is about actively designing ways to regulate civic emotion through coherence, through predictable systems, clear communication, and felt safety rather than trying to control it through manipulation or censorship.
Exactly. Training leaders, media, and institutions to communicate in ways that foster emotional safety and predictability is vital to allow for passionate disagreement without triggering total disintegration.
That's a crucial balance. Fifth, economic justice through narrative calibration.
As we saw with Colombia, economic injustice is deeply tied to symbolic exclusion and humiliation. This pillar is about aligning economic systems and outcomes with narrative systems and symbolic inclusion.
Justice, the book argues, needs to be both structural in resource distribution and symbolic in who is valued and seen. Simply redistributing wealth isn't enough if the underlying stories still frame certain groups as undeserving or invisible.
Right. This pillar works on repairing the narratives that shape economic perception and experience.
And sixth, symbolic identity architecture.
This is about actively redesigning the symbols, flags, myths, heroes, public spaces that form the national nervous system. The goal is to re-architect this symbolic layer to reinforce plural coherence.
Plural coherence.
Yeah.
A sense of shared belonging that can hold diversity.
Yes, rather than reinforce tribal loyalty and division.
When national symbols are politicized and mean different things to different groups, the very idea of a shared national identity fragments. This pillar is about repairing and redesigning that foundational symbolic layer.
Right.
Okay, those six cover a lot of ground.
They do. And the source emphasizes that this framework is deeply recursive. It's not a linear step-by-step process. These 6 dimensions constantly influence each other through complex feedback loops.
Like a shift in linguistic clarity can help stabilize political rhythm, or increased emotional trust enables greater participation in governance.
Exactly. Narrative healing can recalibrate symbolic identity and so on.
And crucially, the book stresses that application requires synchronization, not sequencing. You can't fix one system in isolation.
No, trying to do so leads to fragmentary reforms that are easily undermined by the dysfunctions in the other, still broken systems. This is particularly true in complex, digitally interconnected societies where everything moves and influences everything else rapidly.
The book insists that all 6 dimensions must be upgraded in rhythm, or the repair won't hold.
Which leads to the powerful concept that civic healing is fundamentally a rhythmic engineering problem.
Rhythmic engineering, I like that.
Desynchronized systems generate intense social static, that feeling of emotional fatigue, information overload, constant projection of blame, and pervasive incoherence we feel in polarized times. Civic Synkronia aims to engineer social harmony and function not through heavy-handed control, but by restoring aligned tempo and rhythm across these systems.
The book argues that restoring public rhythm is the most viable path forward.
Fascinating. Which brings us to part 3, where the book gets much more detailed about how this framework is applied, particularly drawing on the rich and complex landscape of Colombia. We'll dig into that right after this short musical break. We're back, diving into part 3 and the practical application of Civic Synkronia, using Colombia's specific challenges to illustrate the framework's tools. Chapter 6 zeroes in on language as infrastructure and introduces the concrete practice of conscious language.
Right. The book is really insistent here. Language is not just expression, it's the fundamental infrastructure that constructs our collective perception, guides our emotions, and encodes social rhythm.
Like roads or a power grid. You don't think about it until it breaks down, but society cannot function without it.
Exactly. And it's never neutral. It carries history, emotion, and symbols. The book argues that polarization begins in language in the specific phrases, metaphors, and narrative frames we use.
And it lays bare the mechanism of polarizing language, contrast framing.
Contrast framing, like setting things up as opposites.
Yes, the reliance on moral binaries, us versus them, good versus evil, economic reductionism, reducing complex issues to simple class struggle, historical guilt traps, using the past to paralyze or assign blame, and identity projection, assuming someone's viewpoint based solely on group affiliation.
The source details how these linguistic structures don't just describe conflict. They actively generate it, cue instant reactivity, oversimplify complex history, and erode the capacity for mutual recognition. They build walls.
Conscious language is presented as the antidote. It's not about being politically correct or just speaking politely. It's system-aware speech.
System-aware. Okay. What are its principles?
Semantic precision, saying exactly what you mean clearly and simply. Narrative honesty, structuring communication based on factual context and systemic reality, not just ideology or desired outcome. And emotional calibration, choosing words and tone that match the desired rhythm and emotional state of the collective nervous system.
It's framed as a design tool for building social coherence. The book emphasizes that this isn't intuitive. It needs to be trained and practiced systematically across civic life.
The source also describes language as symbolic governance, part of the nation's core symbolic operating system. Think of it like the nation's computer code.
Made up of myths, media scripts, slogans, speeches, everyday terminology.
Right. When this code is distorted or divisive, it creates civic incoherence at a fundamental level. Conscious language is seen as the essential semantic backbone. Other reforms will fail if the language system remains corrupted by polarization.
The book uses Colombia as a powerful case study here, right?
Yeah.
Section 6.6.
Yes. It details how both the state and various armed groups historically use language to divide and dehumanize opponents. Terms like oligarchy or castrochavismo on one side, terrorist or bandits on the other, loaded terms.
It notes that even contemporary political discourse, whether from the current administration using language that emphasizes class resentment or the opposition relying on demonizing labels, often operates through this destructive contrast framing.
The book argues that both styles, regardless of political alignment, are linguistically incompatible with civic synkronia because they are designed to assume control in opposition, not build shared coherence.
So Colombia's path to healing, according to the book, absolutely requires recalibrating the public vocabulary, training citizens, leaders, media to use language that supports national rhythm and shared understanding, rather than just seeking rhetorical victories.
And it offers a blueprint for linguistic realignment, 6.7, proposing public semantic reform commissions to audit official language, educational narrative literacy programs, neurolinguistic feedback protocols, and civic vocabulary toolkits offering alternatives to polarizing terms.
It's framed as semantic coherence engineering, actively rebuilding the most basic layer of the collective nervous system. That's a huge task.
It is. Moving to Chapter 7, the focus shifts to political trust, framing it not just as a feeling, but as a rhythmic system.
Another key reframing, trust as a system. How does that work?
The book argues that trust is a dynamic system built on the consistent alignment between several elements: civic behavior, institutional delivery, doing what's promised, symbolic communication, what's shown, and social expectation, what citizens anticipate.
When these align over time, trust becomes predictable, rooted in discernible pattern consistency, rather than relying on the fleeting charisma or promises of individual leaders.
Right. The source states that without this rhythmic anchor of predictable alignment, no political reform can truly embed in the population because the collective nervous system remains in a state of hypervigilance, always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
The symptoms of trust collapse are seen as direct outcomes of rhythmic breakdowns. Hypervigilance, emotional regression into tribalism, over-personalization of policy, and narrative fragmentation where no shared story about the system is believed.
Colombia's history of fractured peace promises and consistent asymmetry between political rhetoric and policy delivery are cited as powerful examples of this desynchronization eroding fundamental trust, words not matching actions repeatedly.
The ontosinclectic view of governance, described in this chapter, is that it must function as a living feedback system, requiring constant rhythm between the narrative, what leaders say, the symbol, how power is displayed, the structure, what is actually delivered, the memory, how actions align with history, and the emotion, the impact on the collective state.
A breakdown in any of these feedback loops generates mistrust. Intentional realignment creates regenerative governance. It's called civic physics, understanding the forces at play.
And because trust is built on pattern, the book argues forcefully that coherence beats charisma in the long run. Nations can't sustain stability by relying solely on charismatic leaders.
Why not? Charisma seems powerful.
Because the national nervous system, the complex web of citizens' expectations and experiences, cannot be held together indefinitely by one person's force of will or personality. It needs structure.
Civic Synkronia aims to design systems where coherent, seen, and predictable, aligned patterns is the fundamental source of trust. This means designing policies that match the tempo of community needs, ensuring public messaging mirrors the actual emotional state of the population without manipulation, training leaders in regulation-based rhetoric that stabilizes rather than excites, and making institutions operate with transparent, understandable rhythms.
Colombia's historical reliance on charismatic figures is seen as insufficient to outregulate a deeply dysregulated civic system. The future lies in pattern architecture, designing trustworthy patterns.
Exactly. The book outlines specific political resynchronization protocols, 7.5, derived from this view. These include civic tempo mapping,
Auditing the speed of policy cycles against community rhythm.
symbol structure alignment audits,
Checking if campaigns match actual impact.
emotional mirror protocols for leaders,
Training leaders to speak from a co-regulated state.
multi-narrative policy framing,
Presenting policies from systemic, symbolic, and historical views.
and implementing trust feedback cycles.
Real-time mechanisms for testing and iterating interventions. Trust, in this framework, isn't declared. It is negotiated and built in rhythm.
Colombia's trust wound, 7.6, is presented not as a moral failing, but as a consequence of these incoherent trust systems. The history is full of inconsistent synchrony, urgent announcements, delayed execution, peace words, divisive rhetoric, faith requested, procedural honesty lacking.
It's a dysregulated civic rhythm, not a lack of inherent goodness.
The conclusion of this chapter is that the future of political trust is fundamentally rhythmic. Consistent delivery, calibrated rhetoric, symbolic honesty, inclusive tempo, emotional regulation. This approach transforms administration from a bureaucratic exercise into a responsive nervous system for collective coherence.
Trust becomes predictable, pattern-based, and stabilizing. Not something to be hoped for, but something to be architected. That's a hopeful thought, actually.
It is. Chapter 8 then shifts focus to healing historical memory, building on the idea of civic memory as a nervous system. The book asserts that the problem isn't memory itself, it's the fragmentation of memory.
That's a crucial distinction. Societies hold memory not just in archives, but dynamically in the collective nervous system, in symbols, in emotional reactions, in language.
In polarized nations, memory becomes a primary weapon. Different groups possess wildly conflicting truths about the same events or figures. The core issue is the lack of a shared protocol, a civic grammar, for holding, integrating, and transmitting these profoundly divergent histories without them tearing the society apart.
The cost of this unresolved, fragmented memory is immense. Inherited blame cycles across generations, symbolic distortion of events into propaganda, and narrative exhaustion where citizens just disengage or retreat into rigid tribal narratives.
In Colombia, the legacy of its long conflict lives vibrantly in the national tone, posture, and vocabulary. Healing requires deep collective narrative alignment.
The book introduces the Ontosinclectic Memory Integration Protocol, OMIP 8.3, as a structured method for addressing this. The principle is that history is not erased, but rather contextualized within a framework of systemic logic and relational impact.
It outlines 5 civic techniques. Timeline restacking,
Creating multi-voice, rhythm-mapped timelines.
civic memory pods,
Structured community spaces for sharing diverse stories.
symbolic reassignment,
Layering new integrative meaning onto charged symbols.
intergenerational dialogue maps,
Bridging narrative memory gaps between generations.
and narrative repair literacy.
Teaching skills to sequence, affirm, and reframe memory with clarity and pacing.
Colombia's Memory Fracture 8.4 is a powerful case study here, with over 9 million registered victims. The Truth Commission was a breakthrough, but its findings also reignited controversy.
The book asks why, suggesting that while truth was revealed, the synchronization was off. Was the symbolic timing right? Did the emotional tone match the collective capacity? Was the systemic follow-through aligned with the pace of truth-telling?
Victims were heard, but perpetrators often remained in power. Justice was delayed, truth revealed, but not rhythmically integrated.
Civic Synkronia, the source explains, doesn't just advocate for telling the truth. It asks about the nation's nervous system readiness for that truth. It asks if the emotional pacing matches the trauma cycle, and if the narrative is constructed from completeness rather than re-traumatization.
This leads to the crucial shift needed from simply memorialization to active repatterning, 8.5. A healed society actively repatterns how memory lives in its civic spaces.
Requires schools teaching history by systemic rhythm, integrative accountability versus vengeance, multi-voice remembrance, embedding symbolic healing in architecture, language, policy.
Exactly. Memory becomes a dynamic, functional part of the civic nervous system, helping society learn and adapt, not remain trapped.
Chapter 8 concludes that the future of collective memory is rhythmic integration, 8.6. Historical truth is rhythmic, not linear. The process doesn't force reconciliation, but works to align story, emotion, and symbolic form until memory is metabolized.
The goal is a shared rhythm across different memories, allowing the society to move in sync with its past, rather than being haunted by shame, trapped by blame, or silenced by denial.
That's a very different way to think about dealing with a difficult past.
Finally, in Part 3, Chapter 9 takes on economic storytelling and structural justice. The book makes a bold claim. Economics is a story before it is a system.
That's a profound point. Every economic system is built upon underlying stories of effort, reward, scarcity, value, ownership.
Fragmented economic stories lead to a fragmented economy, regardless of the raw numbers. The true health of a national economy, in this framework, is measured by the narrative coherence of who is valued, what's earned, and trust in distribution.
In polarized societies like Colombia, wealth isn't just an economic metric. It's a loaded symbol, triggering resentment, suspicion, moral claims. The arena of economic storytelling becomes a primary stage for societal fractures.
The book's approach here is narrative pattern repair, not just debating economic ideologies.
The source identifies 3 common distorted economic narratives that contribute significantly to division. 9.2. The demonization of wealth, all affluence as theft,
The moralization of poverty, poverty as virtue or laziness.
and the illusion of meritocracy, success earned, failure deserved, ignoring systemic barriers. These narratives create vicious emotional loops, policy inertia, and civic mistrust, blocking healing.
To counter these, the book introduces Ontosinclectic economic narrative reframing, OENR 9.3. This protocol aims to realign economic discourse,
It includes techniques like economic memory stacking,
mapping diverse community memories of land, labor, exclusion,
distribution ethics protocols,
reframing tax redistribution as energy flow, feedback, repair,
symbolic rebalancing,
redefining wealth by contribution, trust, regeneration,
and establishing economic humility zones.
civic spaces for sharing diverse economic stories without stereotype.
Colombia's economic narrative collapse, 9.4, is analyzed as rooted in history, land ownership, elites, capture, but also how that history is narrated.
Political actors exploit resentment, wealth as corruption. Elites use moral distancing, merit ignoring violence exclusion.
Result: a civic nervous system where collaboration is distrusted, policy is moral theater, injustice obscured by symbolic war. Healing requires resynchronizing economic stories.
A healed economic narrative, 9.5, according to the book, means a shared grammar for value, labor, fairness, requires civic education, econ theory plus narrative literacy, trans-class storytelling spaces, shifting from distributive conflict to regenerative design.
Can't repair economy without repairing narrative frames shaping perception policy belonging.
The chapter concludes by defining structural justice, 9.6, within this framework. More than redistribution, it's repairing hijacked feedback loops, land, health, education.
Reestablishing trust and fairness of rules institutions, aligning economic rhythms with human rhythms, dignity, labor, time respected, not extracted.
Economic justice truly arrives when the underlying story of value is healed, when wealth doesn't polarize, poverty isn't mythologized. It requires narrative recalibration for rhythm, coherence, trust.
It really emphasizes how interconnected these systems are: economic, narrative, emotional, symbolic. You can't fix one without the others.
Moving into Part 4, the book shifts gears to present the repair protocol, detailing concrete steps and concepts for moving towards coherence. Although labeled Chapter 10 in the source, the content on symbolic identity and national emotion feels like a crucial system repair area that fits perfectly here before diving into the very specific protocols and blueprints.
Absolutely. This chapter reiterates that symbols, flags, national heroes, rituals, public figures are effectively the nervous system of collective identity. They carry immense emotional memory and tell people deep down who they are and what they belong to.
When a society fractures, its symbols fracture too. In Colombia, as the book details, symbols have been intensely politicized, their emotional meaning weaponized, and history turned into a battlefield of competing interpretations.
The result is symbolic incoherence. The national hero of one group is the traitor of another. The flag represents pride for some and pain for others. There's no shared symbolic language.
The book details 3 levels at which this symbolic breakdown occurs. 10.2. Historical symbol collapse, where foundational figures lose shared meaning and become projection vessels.
Cultural ritual dislocation, where ceremonies trigger tension or apathy instead of unity.
And image hijacking mimetic warfare, especially online, where symbols are ripped from context, fragmented, imbued with contradictory meanings, creating dissonance.
This is a profound civic breakdown that blocks trust, belonging, and coordination.
To address this, the book introduces the Symbolic Reconstitution Framework, SRF 10.3, a set of protocols to reintegrate identity and emotion around shared symbols.
Techniques include symbolic memory audits,
Mapping trust division trauma hope associated with symbols across groups.
emotion coherence labs,
Structured processes to understand the diverse emotional charge of symbols, not force agreement.
non-ideological symbol creation.
Designing new symbols tied to universal shared values: dignity, responsibility, justice.
And narrative rewriting protocols.
Aligning how history is taught, discussed to integrate multiple truths around symbols. The book stresses this is reintegration, not censorship.
Colombia's symbolic conflict, 10.4, is a powerful illustration. Historical figures viewed through polarized lenses, rituals as ideological performance, digital platforms circulating context-stripped symbols.
Result is pervasive symbolic dissonance. Citizens unsure what to feel about their own national identity. Coherence needs synchronizing this symbolic nervous system for shared meanings.
The book makes a bold claim by framing national emotion as a civic infrastructure, 10.5.
Yeah.
Like individuals, a nation needs mechanisms for emotional regulation.
A coherent national identity, supported by stable symbols and shared emotional processing, increases trust, reduces polarization, enables learning.
Conversely, a fragmented identity leads to emotional fatigue, fuels extremism, creates self-perpetuating polarization cycles. The book argues this infrastructure can be designed, not manipulated, by intentionally aligning memory, narrative, and belonging through integrative history education, community storytelling festivals, symbolic holidays, acknowledging diverse experiences, structured civic dialogues.
Key principles for achieving this emotional repair via symbolic alignment. 10.6 include fostering civic emotional literacy,
Distinguishing manipulated versus meaningful emotions.
creating collective mourning spaces,
Designing civic rituals for processing trauma constructively.
establishing symbolic design ethics,
Setting standards for how institutions use symbols to protect coherence.
and engaging in conscious civic myth building.
Creating new stories, connecting old ones in a shared arc. Holding complexity. A healed nation shares a deep enough symbolic language to hold disagreement.
This chapter makes it clear that the emotional and symbolic layers are not soft secondary issues. They are foundational to civic health and require active, intentional design and repair.
Yet, just like economic or political systems, it's all interconnected infrastructure.
Chapter 12 brings the focus back to where the book argues it must ultimately begin: the individual, with your personal resynchronization protocol, PRP.
The personal level. This chapter makes the case that personal coherence is fundamentally political.
That's a powerful link, and one that might resonate deeply with you listening. The argument is that collective healing needs individuals who are themselves rhythmically aligned and able to embody coherence, especially amidst external chaos.
In polarized societies, citizens aren't just passive recipients of the national nervous system's stress, they are also carriers of that stress and potential repair nodes. The book states you simply cannot build civic synchronia without working towards synchronized human units.
The PRP is presented not as a rigid self-help program, but as a concrete, modular, biologically rooted framework for cultivating individual coherence across different dimensions of life, synchronizing your emotion, body, language, and sense of time.
The principles of the PRP 12.2 are grounded. Biology sets the rhythm, nervous system, sleep cycles. Narrative clarity stabilizes coherence. Your stories create alignment or fragmentation. Relational hygiene is systemic infrastructure. Interaction patterns determine bandwidth. Cognitive detox is non-negotiable, clearing noise loops. And civic impact starts with self-synchrony. Your internal rhythm sets the tone for external spaces.
It's framed as a daily commitment to make yourself a more usable, less reactive node for the larger civic repair process.
The PRP is designed across 5 layers, 12.3, described as an adaptable living architecture you build for yourself. Layer 1 is foundational anchors.
The non-negotiables: consistent physiological baseline sleep-wake cycles, light, movement, meals, wind-down ritual, seen as mandatory for regulating basic nervous system rhythm.
Layer 2 is the emotional regulation stack. Uses a model called RISE. Recognize emotion, integrate its pattern, somatic release, movement, breath, and code experience with closure. builds nervous system agility.
Layer 3 is the relational synchrony schedule, intentionally designing weekly, monthly human contact rhythms, micro touch points, repair moments, co-regulation rituals. Maintaining healthy relational rhythm is seen as a civic function.
Layer 4 is cognitive and narrative hygiene, organizing your internal mental field for coherence. Morning brain dump, weekly narrative audit, what stories am I telling? Symbolic re-entry rituals, mindful media regulation, synchronizing internal perception.
And layer 5 is adaptive cycle tuning, acknowledging life isn't linear, adjusting your protocol based on energy cycles, stress, life events, downshift in grief, expand during activation, track metrics like HRV sleep, working with your system's rhythms.
The book stresses the immense political power of a regulated nervous system. 12.4. Synchronized individuals stabilize civic fields, diffuse tension with calm, hold dual truths, serve as narrative bridges, model repair without reactivity.
It's described as essential political training for functioning effectively in a post-polarization society.
The PRP is framed explicitly as a foundational tool for civic resynchronization. 12.5. Imagine scaling this protocol in schools, ministries, communities. Civic Synkronia scales from this internal rhythm outward.
Chapter 12 provides the architecture for personal coherence, emphasizing this internal work is not separate from civic repair. The next chapters embed it into collective systems.
Okay, so the personal practice feeds the collective.
Chapter 13 then builds on personal rhythm by discussing the critical role of civic rituals and collective integration in societal healing. The book points to a key deficiency in modern nations, a collapse of shared, functional civic rituals.
The source argues that modern societies often lack common rhythms and symbolic structures that help people process difficult experiences, stabilize identity, navigate conflict, mourn together, experience renewal.
Without these rituals, reforms fail to land and embed in the population's nervous system. Colombia, the book notes, has immense resilience, but often isolated, under unprocessed collective trauma, lacking structured civic containers for synchronized healing.
Rituals, in this sense, aren't just symbolic performances. They are functional tools for encoding collective memory, aligning shared emotion, redistributing psychic load. Their absence escalates polarization and deteriorates trust.
The book describes ritual itself as a form of system design. 13.2. For a ritual to be effective, it must be cyclic, predictable, layered, narrative, movement, symbol, presence, structured, repeatable, open, inclusive, and feedback-based, evolves via participation.
They are not just reenactments of the past, but are designed to encode potential futures, providing containers to process pain, realign language, re-symbolize identity.
It outlines 3 core categories of civic rituals, 13.3, serving distinct structural functions. First, grief and transition rituals.
Designed to process national communal pain, break cycles of silence, denial, revenge. Examples: National Closure Week, local memory circles, public mourning days.
Second category, initiation and responsibility rituals.
Aimed at embedding identity of shared responsibility, shifting psyche from passive consumer to active co-creator. Examples: civic initiation for young adults, civic anchor days for narrative repair contribution.
And the third category, rhythmic synchrony rituals.
Explicitly designed to rebuild trust in collective time, regulate systemic stress, reestablish communal tempo, provide containers for coherence. Examples: monthly town square events, biannual national reflection windows, year-end civic synchrony week.
The goal is for these rhythmic rituals to become embedded as civic infrastructure, 13.4, structuring them into governance calendars, media, community rhythms, actively repatterns collective behavior over time.
They allow trust to build through predictability. Citizens know when and how concerns will be heard, healing prioritized, identity recalibrated. Colombia lacks these integration structures nationally.
Its future depends on intentionally synchronizing the processing of language, pain, joy, responsibility into rhythmic structures that outlast conflict.
The book mentions a ritual design blueprint is provided later, emphasizing contextual design, not imitation. Restoring rhythm where systems collapsed. Society not argued, but resynchronized ritually, emotionally, structurally.
This highlights, for you considering action, that repair isn't just about policy or protest. It's about building embodied practice and shared experience back into the civic landscape.
Absolutely. It's about the how, not just the what.
Chapter 14 brings everything together, presenting a blueprint for rhythm-based nation building. It frames polarization as the visible fracture, but desynchronization as the invisible architecture causing it.
The book argues that a nation fundamentally breaks down when the rhythm of collective life fails. This rhythm is structural tempo of public time, narrative cycles, decision speed, ritual function, all fragmented dune-aligned.
The Civic Synkronia model for nation building is a comprehensive approach based on intentional resynchronization across 5 core interconnected layers.
These layers build upon each other, offering a practical, systemic, and potentially measurable approach. Let's outline these 5 core layers of synchrony. First, narrative synchrony.
Aligning storylines without erasing diversity requires repositories of plural narratives, local narrative councils, cross-narrative platforms, policies mandating plural symbolic representation, creates narrative equity via structured plurality.
Second is symbolic synchrony. Restoring trust via co-creation of symbols. Involves participatory redesign, modular symbols, rotating holidays, design sprints for new metaphors, evaluating naming systems, builds emotional coherence.
Third is emotional synchrony. Actively encoding emotional logic into civic life requires public emotional infrastructure, grief reflection repair spaces, emotional literacy in schools, institutionalizing collective mourning, forgiveness, reconciliation, even an emotional dashboard measuring sentiment.
A nation lacking emotion mechanisms becomes reactive manipulable.
Fourth is temporal synchrony. Intentionally redesigning time at the civic level, aligning decision-making with natural emotional cultural cycles, synchronizing calendars with rituals reviews, calibrating policy rhythms on stress recovery data, regulating news cycles for synthesis reflection versus crisis.
Synchronized time allows meaning-stress recalibration.
And fifth is structural synchrony, moving from fragmented institutions to aligned ones. Redesigning institutions with ontosinclectic protocols, co-design, plural structure, layered feedback, ministries as modular civic ecosystems, local Synkronia pods, governance emotion labor recalibrate locally, civic integration index measuring alignment.
Allows local variation without collapse.
The book emphasizes that civic synkronia in action is a living system, not a rigid blueprint, 14.7. Implementation won't be identical everywhere, must adapt to context.
It's presented as a systemic method for diagnosis and design, asking, which layer's broken? What misalignment's causing stress? What rituals, timelines, protocols repair without repeating domination?
Not new ideology, but new architecture rebuilding from rhythm, not fear.
A fundamentally different approach.
We've covered a vast and intricate amount of ground from this book, using Colombia's challenges to understand the universal principles. Chapter 15 serves as the conclusion, bringing these ideas to a powerful close.
The conclusion effectively recaps the core diagnosis. Polarization as a signal of deep systemic desynchronization across symbolic, emotional, institutional narrative systems.
It reiterates the argument that language is infrastructure, symbolic misalignment erodes trust, trauma shapes policy, and therefore no single reform works in isolation.
It then frames Civic Synkronia as the comprehensive path forward, not a single policy, but a multidimensional repair protocol, a structured systems-based method for identifying and realigning these broken rhythms.
And critically, it emphasizes that while Colombia served as the essential field of application, the principles and framework apply universally to any fractured society.
It's not about exporting a specific solution, but importing a logic of alignment, a method of resynchronization adaptable locally.
The core message reiterated is that restoring a polarized society is fundamentally a rhythmic process, not a static end state, but a rhythm to be designed, a cadence cultivated ongoingly.
This requires active emotional integration, symbolic co-ownership, intentionally institutionalizing processes, regulating time, memory, trust.
It completely reframes national repair as ongoing emotional structural synchrony, moving away from ideological conversion or winning a culture war. The future of democratic coherence depends on deeper, adaptable systems synchronized with human rhythms and civic truth.
And the conclusion ends with a really powerful invitation to you, the reader, the listener, an invitation to co-design.
The book provides the architecture, the framework, the protocols. But healing, true civic synkronia, only begins when people choose to design together, cross pain, differing memories, earn distrust.
It's an acknowledgement that no single person, party, or ideology restores coherence. It requires a culture of mutual design and ongoing practice. Synkronia is the living rhythm of governance, emotional structure, relational practice.
And in a direct address, the book tells you, the reader, you are part of its next draft, suggesting every conversation, reframed sentence, narrative repair gesture extends the meaning and potential into the real world.
The final synthesis is a call to rebuild the fractured nation, not by fighting harder, but by healing its rhythm. Civic Synkronia offers a path of intentional coherence, designed alignment, structural renewal. Not theory, but practical, grounded civic evolution. The closing thought resonates. The rhythm is yours to build.
That is a incredibly compelling and actionable place to land after exploring such a complex problem. It moves the conversation from just feeling overwhelmed by division to seeing that there's a tangible, albeit challenging, path for intentional action, starting even at the most personal level.
It powerfully shifts the perspective from despair about polarization to the possibility of intentional design and ongoing repair across multiple, interconnected layers of society.
So we've taken this deep dive into Civic Synkronia for Colombia, using the framework applied there to truly understand the underlying architecture of division and explore a structured, multidimensional protocol for repair.
And the book makes a very strong case that this isn't just a specific solution for one country. It's a foundational model for diagnosing and potentially healing any society grappling with deep fragmentation and desynchronization.
It leaves us with a lot to consider about the true nature of societal division and what meaningful, lasting repair might actually look like, going far beyond just the political headlines.
It forces us to look beyond ideology and into the fundamental rhythms of language, memory, emotion, and the very structure of our collective life. It's profound stuff.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to carry with you after this deep dive. If our national disagreements are less about what we fundamentally believe and more about a breakdown in our collective rhythm and connection, thinking about your own life, what rhythms are you personally out of sync with that might be contributing to that larger societal dissonance?
Or, taking the book's powerful analogy, if our societies are living nervous systems carrying stress and trauma, and we are nodes within that system, how does cultivating your own personal coherence, your own internal rhythm, directly impact the health and potential for repair of the whole?
Something to think about as you move through your day. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.